Imagine, a secret army existed in Europe for decades, and almost nobody knew it was there. No uniforms, no public headquarters, no newspapers announcing its existence. Just hidden weapons, secret communications, underground networks, and men trained to disappear if the Soviet army ever crossed into Western Europe. They called it Gladio. But here is the question that changed everything. If this secret army was created to fight a war that never came, what happened to it when the war never started? Why were weapons hidden across Europe? Who trained these secret operatives? Who gave them their orders? And why did democratic governments keep the entire network hidden from their own citizens? For decades, the Cold War divided Europe. On one side stood NATO. On the other stood the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Between them was the Iron Curtain. And behind that curtain was the fear of a conflict that could destroy the entire continent. Western intelligence agencies believed if Soviet forces invaded, governments could collapse within days. Military bases could be captured. Communication lines could be destroyed. Cities could fall, and millions of people could suddenly find themselves living under an occupying power. So, Western governments prepared for something almost unimaginable. They created secret resistance networks. Ordinary-looking men were trained for extraordinary circumstances. Weapons were hidden. Radio equipment was concealed. Safe locations were prepared. Emergency communication systems were established. The plan was simple. If the invasion came, disappear, survive, communicate. Resist, wait for liberation. On paper, it was a defensive strategy. But history rarely remains as simple as the plan written on paper. Because the Soviet invasion never came, the secret networks remained. And in Italy, where political tensions were already reaching dangerous levels, the existence of one of these networks would eventually become connected to one of the most controversial chapters of the Cold War. Bombings, political violence, far-right extremism, far-left terrorism, intelligence operations, accurate documents, hide weapons, and accusations that governments had allowed darkness to become a weapon. But before we go any further, there is something important you need to understand. Not every claim surrounding Gladio is proven. Some events are firmly documented, some allegations remain disputed, and some theories have grown far beyond the available evidence. So this is not a story where every mystery automatically becomes proof of a conspiracy. This is a story about separating the documents from the rumors, the evidence from the allegations, and the historical record from the legends that grew around it. Because the truth about Operation Gladio is already disturbing enough without exaggeration. The organization existed. Secret weapons caches existed. Stay behind networks existed. And for decades, ordinary citizens were largely unaware that these structures had been created in their countries. Then, the Cold War began to collapse. The Berlin Wall fell. Communist governments across Eastern Europe began disappearing. The Soviet Union itself was approaching its final days, and as the old world disappeared, one of its best-kept secrets finally began to emerge. Investigators discovered evidence pointing toward a hidden organization in Italy. The name appeared: Gladio. And suddenly, the question was no longer whether the secret army existed. The government itself had to acknowledge it. But that created an even bigger mystery. If Gladio had been created to fight a Soviet invasion, Why had it remained so important after the invasion never happened? And what had its members actually been doing during the years of peace? That question would lead investigators into Italy's darkest period, a period known as the Years of Lead, a time when bombs exploded in public places, when politicians were kidnapped, when extremists fought extremists, when fear became part of everyday life, and when intelligence agencies operated behind layers of secrecy. Some investigators began asking whether these worlds were connected. Were they? Or were completely separate events being pulled together years later because the existence of Gladio made the connections look inevitable? That is the mystery we are going to investigate. Because Operation Gladio was never just about one secret organization. It was about an entire system built during an age of fear. An age when governments believed that the next war could begin tomorrow. An age when secrecy was considered necessary for survival. And an age when the people protecting democracy sometimes operated completely outside public view. So prepare yourself, because we are going behind the Iron Curtain, not to investigate the Soviet secret services, but to uncover a hidden world on the western side of Europe. A world of classified files, secret armies, hidden weapons, intelligence officers, political extremists, and unanswered questions. This is the story of Operation Gladio, the secret army that was built for a war that never came. The revelation of Gladio did not simply uncover a forgotten Cold War defense plan. It opened a door, and behind that door was an entire world of intelligence operations, political violence, secret organizations, hidden weapons, and unanswered questions. For decades, the Italian public had lived through one of the most violent periods in modern European history without knowing that a secret stay-behind network existed inside the country. Then the Cold War began to collapse. And suddenly, investigators had a name, Gladio. But knowing the name was only the beginning. The next question was much more difficult. What had Gladio actually done? To understand why that question became so explosive, we have to return to Italy during the years of lead. The late 1960s and 1970s were years of extraordinary political tension. Italy was a democracy, but it was a democracy under pressure. The Communist Party was enormously powerful. The country was divided between left-wing and right-wing political forces. Student protests were spreading. Workers were striking. Far-left revolutionary organizations were emerging. Far-right extremist groups were also becoming increasingly violent. Bombings became part of the political landscape. Assassinations became possible. Kidnappings became terrifyingly real. And behind all of this was the Cold War. For Western governments, Italy was strategically important. Country sat directly in the Mediterranean. It was a NATO member. It hosted American military forces. And it had one of the largest communist parties in Western Europe. Washington and other Western capitals watched Italian politics carefully. They feared that a communist-led government could eventually come to power. The Italian Communist Party, however, was not simply an underground revolutionary organization. It was a major political force with millions of voters. It participated in elections. It controlled local governments. It had trade union connections and deep roots in Italian society. This created a complicated contradiction. The Western Alliance publicly defended democratic elections. At the same time, Many Western officials feared what might happen if communist political influence became too powerful. That fear shaped the intelligence environment. And then came the violence. In December 1969, a bomb exploded at the Banca Nazionale dell'Agricoltura in Milan's Piazza Fontana. 17 people died. More than 80 were wounded. The attack shocked Italy. It was one of the events that helped mark the beginning of the years of lead. Investigators looked at different political groups. Far left and far right extremists became subjects of investigation. But the case became increasingly complicated. Accusations emerged involving extremist organizations. There were also allegations that elements within the security establishment had attempted to interfere with investigations or misdirect suspicion. Years of trials followed. Evidence was disputed. People were acquitted. Other individuals were convicted in later proceedings. The legal history was extremely complicated, and that complexity is important. Because decades later, when Gladio became public, people naturally began asking, was the secret stay-behind network connected to the violence? This is where we need to be careful. The existence of Gladio does not automatically prove that Gladio organized terrorist attacks. Those are two different claims. The historical record establishes the existence of the stay-behind network. It also establishes the existence of political terrorism and extremist violence in Italy. But the question of whether Gladio, as an organization, directed specific terrorist attacks remains contested. That distinction is essential. Otherwise, the story becomes mythology instead of history. Still, investigators discovered enough connections between intelligence circles, extremist networks, and political violence to create serious questions. And those questions became even more intense after another major tragedy. In 1974, a bomb exploded during an anti-fascist demonstration in Brescia. 8 people were killed, dozens were injured. Again, the country was shocked. Again, investigations followed. Again, far-right extremism became a major focus. Italy was beginning to understand that political violence was not an isolated phenomenon. Something deeper was happening. Extremist organizations were competing for influence. Some wanted revolutionary change. Others wanted to destroy the left. And ordinary citizens were caught in the middle. Then came one of the most infamous episodes of all. The kidnapping of former Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro. Moro was one of Italy's most important political figures. He was a leading member of the Christian Democratic Party, and he had been involved in efforts to create a political arrangement that could potentially bring the Communist Party into a broader governing framework. This was known as the Historic Compromise. To many observers, the idea was revolutionary. The Christian Democrats had dominated Italian politics. The Communists were the strongest opposition force. Moro believed some form of political cooperation might help stabilize the country. But the idea terrified some people. Far-left militants viewed the Italian political system as a symbol of capitalism and American influence. On March 16, 1978, members of the Red Brigades attacked Moro's convoy. 5 members of his security detail were killed. Moro was kidnapped. Italy entered a state of shock. For 55 days, the country watched as the government tried to respond. The Red Brigades demanded concessions. The government refused. Moro wrote letters from captivity. He pleaded for negotiation, but the government largely maintained its refusal to negotiate. On May 9, 1978, Aldo Moro's body was discovered inside a car in Rome. He had been murdered. The killing transformed Italian politics, and it created a permanent mystery. Could Moro's death have been prevented? Did intelligence agencies know more than they admitted? Were there hidden political interests involved? Were foreign governments involved? Or was the kidnapping simply the work of the Red Brigades? Over the years, countless theories emerged. Some were supported by evidence, others were not. Parliamentary investigations examined the case. New evidence appeared. Old testimony was reconsidered. But the Moro case remained one of the great unresolved mysteries of modern Italian political history. And because Gladio existed in the same secret intelligence environment, investigators inevitably examined whether there were connections. Again, evidence and speculation had to be separated. The Red Brigades were a genuine terrorist organization. They had their own ideology. They carried out kidnappings, assassinations, and attacks. There is no need to invent a secret organization to explain their existence. But the wider political environment surrounding the Moro case was extraordinarily complex. And intelligence failures raised questions that have never completely disappeared. Then, in August 1980, another horrific attack shocked Italy. A bomb exploded at Bologna's central railway station. 85 people were killed. More than 200 were injured. It became the deadliest terrorist attack in modern Italian history. The bombing was eventually associated with far-right extremist perpetrators. Investigations and trials continued for years. Individuals connected to neo-fascist terrorism were convicted. But controversy continued over alleged intelligence links, obstruction, and the broader network surrounding the attack. And this is where the Gladio story became particularly sensitive, because the Italian secret stay-behind organization was itself anti-communist, and some of the individuals and networks discussed in investigations into political violence also existed within Italy's broader anti-communist environment. But again, association is not proof. A person can be connected to an intelligence network without that network directing a terrorist attack. An extremist can have intelligence contacts without becoming an intelligence operative. And an intelligence officer can make a decision that does not represent the policy of an entire organization. These distinctions matter enormously. History is rarely controlled by one hidden hand. More often, it is a collision of institutions, individuals, fears, mistakes, ambitions, and unintended consequences. The Gladio controversy became powerful precisely because it sat at the intersection of all of these forces. There was another major problem. The intelligence world is designed around compartmentalization. One person may know only one part of an operation. One agency may not know what another agency is doing. One government department may have information that another department does not. And when documents are classified or destroyed, historians are left with incomplete evidence. This makes intelligence history particularly difficult. Sometimes the absence of evidence does not prove that something never happened, but it also cannot be used as proof that something did happen. That is one of the central lessons of the Gladio controversy. The existence of secrets creates an environment where almost any unexplained event can attract a conspiracy theory. But the historian's job is to ask, what can we actually prove? What documents exist? What testimony exists? What did courts establish? What remains alleged? And what is simply speculation? The Italian investigation into Gladio eventually revealed that the network had been created during the Cold War as a stay-behind force. Its members were trained to resist a possible invasion. Weapons caches were reportedly established. Communication systems were prepared. The organization was linked to Italian military intelligence. And there were connections to the broader Western intelligence structure. The Italian government acknowledged the network's existence. But another question remained. Was NATO directly commanding Gladio? The answer is complicated. NATO had structures related to the coordination of stay-behind preparations. One organization often discussed is the Allied Clandestine Committee. Its history is real, but the precise degree of operational control exercised by NATO over each national network is a matter of historical debate. The idea that NATO itself operated every secret army as a single centralized organization is an oversimplification. National intelligence agencies retained important control. Different countries had different arrangements. Different networks had different histories. So when people say NATO's secret army, the phrase is dramatic. But historically, it needs qualification. Gladio was an Italian stay-behind organization operating within a wider Western Cold War security environment. That is a more accurate description, and perhaps that reality is even more interesting, because it shows how the Cold War was not controlled by one central organization. It was a web: American intelligence, European intelligence, military institutions, political leaders, AFICRET committees, national governments, and individuals operating within those systems. The network was designed for one purpose: survive a Soviet invasion. But no Soviet invasion happened. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the reason for the network disappeared. So, why was the organization not publicly exposed earlier? The answer is partly secrecy. Governments argued that revealing the network would compromise national security. If citizens knew who the members were, the resistance network could be compromised. If weapons caches were publicly identified, they could be stolen. If communication systems were revealed, they could be neutralized. If foreign intelligence services knew the structure, they could infiltrate it. From a national security perspective, secrecy made sense. From a democratic accountability perspective, the problem was obvious. Citizens had no opportunity to debate the existence of an armed organization operating outside ordinary public knowledge. Parliamentary oversight was limited, and that creates a fundamental democratic dilemma. How much secrecy can a democracy tolerate in the name of security? The question is not unique to Gladio. Every modern intelligence service faces it. Governments must keep certain information secret. But secrecy without oversight can become dangerous. And oversight without secrecy can make intelligence operations impossible. The balance is difficult. Gladio became a historical example of what happens when that balance is pushed too far towards secrecy. Then came the collapse of the Soviet Union. The threat that had justified the organization disappeared. And suddenly, the existence of the network looked different. What had once been described as a shield against invasion now appeared to many citizens as an unexplained secret army. That change in perspective was enormous. During the Cold War, secrecy could be defended as necessary. After the Cold War, the same secrecy looked suspicious. The historical context had changed. The enemy was gone. The public wanted answers. And the archives began to matter. Documents became the battlefield. Investigators searched for evidence of what the organization had done. Were weapons still hidden? Who had access? Which people had been recruited? Who trained them? Who funded them? How were they connected to intelligence agencies? Were any members involved in political violence? Some answers emerged, others remained uncertain. The weapons caches were real. The stay-behind organization was real. The intelligence connections were real. But the biggest allegations remained difficult to prove conclusively. This is why responsible historians continue to distinguish between the documented Gladio network and the broader strategy of tension theory. The strategy of tension argument proposes that certain actors deliberately encouraged political violence to create fear and push society toward authoritarian or anti-communist responses. There is evidence of extremist violence and evidence of intelligence's involvement in parts of the wider political environment. There were also cases of manipulation and obstruction. But proving that a single centrally directed operation, called Gladio, orchestrated the entire strategy is a much stronger claim. And that claim requires stronger evidence. Some researchers believe the evidence points toward deeper connections. Others argue that the connections have been exaggerated. The debate continues. But perhaps there is a more important lesson. The Cold War produced a culture in which governments were willing to prepare for almost unimaginable scenarios. Secret armies, nuclear shelters, underground communications, espionage networks, covert propaganda, political influence, and contingency plans for the collapse of governments. People living ordinary lives rarely saw this world. They went to work, they raised families, they voted, they watched television, they read newspapers. But beneath that normal life was an enormous security apparatus preparing for catastrophe. Gladio was one part of that hidden world. And when the secret finally became public, it forced Europe to confront an uncomfortable reality. Democracy can defend itself using secret institutions. But those institutions must still remain accountable, because the difference between a secret defense network and an uncontrolled secret army is not simply the weapons it possesses. It is the oversight surrounding it. Who can investigate it? Who can stop it? Who can prosecute its members? Who can inspect its finances? Who can demand answers? And what happens when the government itself is the institution that must investigate the institution? These are not historical questions only. They remain relevant today. Every government facing a serious threat is tempted to expand secrecy. Every intelligence agency can argue that more information must remain classified. Every national security institution can say that disclosure could endanger lives. Sometimes that is true. But history shows that secrecy can also hide mistakes, abuses, corruption, and political manipulation. Gladio therefore became a symbol, not necessarily of one giant conspiracy, but of the dangers created when security structures exist outside public awareness for too long. And there is another fascinating part of the story. The people involved in these networks were not necessarily movie-style spies. Many were ordinary citizens. Some had military backgrounds. Some had intelligence connections. Some were recruited because they were considered politically reliable. They were trained for a future that might never come, imagining being told, "You may never be called upon, but if the enemy invades, you must disappear." Imagine hiding weapons for years. Imagine carrying knowledge that your neighbors do not possess. Imagine knowing that your government has built a secret organization, but being unable to tell anyone. The psychological burden would have been enormous. And yet the people who participated believed they were preparing to defend their country. That is another reason the story cannot simply be divided into heroes and villains. History is more complicated. Some people may have genuinely believed they were protecting democracy. Some intelligence officials may have believed secrecy was necessary. Some politicians may have feared communist expansion. Some extremists may have exploited those fears for their own purposes. And some individuals may have crossed lines that their governments never intended them to cross. Institutions are made of people, and people do not always behave according to the official purpose of the institution. That may be the most important lesson of all. A structure created for one purpose can be used for another. A secret network designed for invasion can become politically controversial during peacetime. A weapon hidden for defense can become a liability. An intelligence relationship created for security can become a source of suspicion. And a government that hides information for legitimate reasons can eventually lose public trust. By the early 1990s, the Cold War world was gone. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The Warsaw Pact had disappeared. Eastern Europe was transforming. NATO itself was adapting to a new era. The strategic assumptions behind the stay-behind networks had changed completely. Some networks were dismantled, some were reorganized, some details remained classified. And historians continued studying the evidence. But the legacy of Gladio remained. It became one of the most powerful examples of the hidden architecture of the Cold War. It showed that the confrontation between East and West was not only about tanks and missiles. It was also about secret planning. It was about fear. It was about political influence. It was about information. And sometimes it was about preparing for a war that never arrived. But the story leaves us with one final question. Was Gladio a secret army designed to defend democracy? Or did the secrecy surrounding it create the possibility for something much darker? The most honest answer is uncomfortable. The historical record supports the first part clearly. Stay-behind networks were created to prepare for a possible Soviet occupation. The second part is more complicated. There were serious allegations and documented connections between intelligence circles, extremist networks, and political violence in Italy. There were investigations. There were convictions. There were intelligence scandals. There were unanswered questions. But not every allegation against Gladio has been proven, and not every act of political violence can be attributed to the organization. That distinction should never be forgotten, because the truth does not need exaggeration. The existence of a secret army inside a democracy is already extraordinary. The fact that the public knew little about it for decades is already extraordinary. The discovery of hidden weapons caches is already extraordinary. The connection to the wider Cold War intelligence system is already extraordinary. And the political violence that surrounded Italy during the same era is already one of the darkest chapters of European history. You do not need to turn every mystery into a conspiracy to understand how disturbing the story really is. Perhaps the most important question is not, was everything controlled by Gladio? Perhaps the better question is, what happens to democracy when fear becomes powerful enough to justify secrecy without limits? That question does not belong only to the Cold War. It belongs to every generation. Because governments will always face threats. There will always be enemies. There will always be emergencies. And there will always be officials who argue that secrecy is necessary. Sometimes it is. But history reminds us that power becomes dangerous when nobody is allowed to question it. Operation Gladio began as a contingency plan, a secret network waiting for an invasion, a force designed to survive behind enemy lines. The enemy never came, but the network remained. And when its existence finally became public, Europe was forced to look backward and ask what had been happening in the shadows. The documents could reveal structures. Investigations could establish facts. Trials could establish responsibility in individual cases. But some questions remained buried beneath decades of secrecy. And perhaps that is why the name Gladio continues to fascinate historians. Not because every conspiracy theory surrounding it is true, but because the organization itself was real. The weapons were real. The secret planning was real. The Cold War fear was real. And the political violence that surrounded its history was real. The mystery lives in the spaces between those facts, in the unanswered questions, in the missing records, in the conflicting testimonies, in the decisions made behind closed doors, and in the people who knew something about the network, but carried that knowledge silently for decades. The Cold War ended. The Iron Curtain disappeared. The Soviet Union collapsed. But the questions created by that secret world did not disappear with it. They remain reminders of a difficult truth. A government can build a secret institution to protect democracy. But once that institution exists, democracy must still find a way to protect itself from the institution. And that is the enduring legacy of Operation Gladio. Not simply a secret army, not simply a conspiracy, but a warning about secrecy, fear, power, and the fragile line between protecting a nation and operating beyond the knowledge of the people that nation is supposed to serve. The secret army was created for a war that never came. The Cold War ended. The weapons were discovered. The files were opened. The name became public, and history began asking questions. Some received answers. Others did not. But perhaps the greatest lesson is this. The absence of war does not mean the absence of preparation, and the absence of public knowledge does not mean the absence of history. Sometimes, the most important chapters of history are the ones that governments hoped would remain classified. Operation Gladio was one of those chapters. And once the secret finally came into the light, Europe could never look at the Cold War in quite the same way again.